Hello again. Welcome to this final lecture on the philosophy of food, specifically dealing with Pollan's book In Defense of Food. So, as I mentioned in the previous video, what we need to do after considering everything that Pollan has discussed about nutritionism and about the Western diet and need to return to culture, and specifically with regard to the practical rules, these sort of normative prescriptions that he gives us at the end of the book. Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. Now that we've considered all that, what I want to do is focus on some objections. And these are important to consider. In fact, that's a really a central part of doing good philosophy is to think critically about the things that we're considering. Think critically and consider whether or not the views that we are digesting, if you will, whether or not there are holes or problems in these views. And that means we need to consider the objections. So that's what I want to do now in this video. So the first objection that I want to consider is based upon this kind of socioeconomic reality that might suggest Pollan's view is not very practical or not feasible. And so this is really a kind of a pragmatic objection. To what extent is it really the case that his prescription of eating food, mostly plants, not too much, if this kind of way of approaching things, if it's practical for most of Americans, right? Pollan's advice presupposes a kind of economic flexibility. It presupposes that most people have the required time in their day, the required money that they can afford to follow the rules that he suggests. And it presupposes that most of us have the right kind of access to resources. And it may turn out that that's just not the case. It might be the case that most of us do not have access to the resources he thinks we have. We don't have the kind of money or available time in our day to really to embrace, even if we think that his rules are good. Still, we may not in a practical sense be able to do this. Consider, for example, some of the issues that we've discussed previously in the semester. Things like food deserts. Remember that a food desert is a place where there is more than enough food available to people, but not locally, not where they happen to live, right? It's not that we can't make food available, it's that people live in these densely populated areas where there literally is no supermarket, no local farmers market, or anything other than like a gas station or a McDonald's or what have you, some fast food restaurant, right? There's lots of these sorts of food deserts that are all over the United States and in every single major metropolitan area, right? So people living in these sorts of food deserts where produce is scarce or it's just simply non-existent, where healthy foods cost significantly more than processed foods, or where transportation itself simply isn't available or is very, very limited, perhaps impossible for some people to access, right? So in these sorts of cases, dealing with food deserts, I think this suggests that Pollan's recommendations at least implicitly target a very narrow portion of the population, a kind of privileged demographic, which undermines, I think, his normative claims, right? So his book may be great advice for people living in suburbs or people like my own family who are able to go to the farmers market whenever we want. But that's just a small part of the population, right? What about everybody else? Can we really think of these normative claims that we should eat real food, mostly plants and not too much? Is that going to be practical for everyone? It's not clear that it will be at all. And so this is, I think, kind of an elitist approach to the philosophy of food, even though he does claim that it's not an elitist approach. Nonetheless, I'm very skeptical of whether or not that's the case. Indeed, even outside of food deserts, we still have concerns about economic inequalities, right? Where whole foods or organic produce and ethically sourced good foods are often just far too expensive. And remember that Pollan literally says we should embrace more expensive foods. He says that when we eat more expensive foods, this means that we're eating better foods, that the cheaper foods are bad for us. But anybody living in today's reality recognizes that we are struggling with high cost of simple things like milk and eggs and meat, chicken, or what have you, right? Things cost a lot right now with inflation and numerous other things. We got skyrocketing healthcare costs, people losing their jobs, all kinds of different problems with being able to afford the basic necessities. So even outside of food deserts, it's just not clear that it's a realistic claim that we should focus on these more expensive, ethically sourced, good, organic produce and whole foods and so forth, right? For many families, Pollan's ideal diet is simply unaffordable. Indeed, we might think that there's another kind of an objection here, an objection we might call the hidden cost objection. So, what does this objection say? Well, it says that there are all kinds of other costs that we should be concerned with, in addition to the actual financial burdens that families have to undergo. Right. So these are the hidden costs that Pollan simply does not account for. There are costs that are not necessarily seen, or at least not seen right away. Things like the time people spend shopping, the time people spend cooking or cleaning their kitchen, or maybe the lack of childcare that would be required in order to do more cooking and to do more shopping, or things like inflexible work schedules that doesn't allow for people to be able to take on these newer kinds of burdens associated with eating better whole foods and so forth. Right. So these are the kinds of burdens that disproportionately affect low income households. So again, it does start to look like this is really kind of an elitist approach to diet. And if we're thinking about diet in terms of a way of living, a kind of way of structuring your life, well, then it looks like Pollan's view only is going to apply to a very small minority of the larger population. People that have the privilege of being able to spend time cooking and cleaning and have childcare and flexible work schedules and things of this sort. Indeed, when Pollan prescribes that we should cook real food, this assumes a substantial amount of time for things like meal planning, for preparation, not just the cooking itself. And oftentimes, unfortunately, this could end up being quite misogynistic, right? It assumes a kind of gendered labor, right? Historically, domestic food labor has fallen on women, calling for a return to home cooking without addressing the kind of gender inequalities that exist in our society. This risks romanticizing an arrangement rooted in unequal labor distribution, where it's primarily the women in a household that's doing the shopping, that's doing the preparation, that's doing the actual cooking. So even if Pollan doesn't explicitly endorse this misogynistic view of labor with regard to food, nonetheless, it does look like it's a risk that we should pay close attention to. So there is this other kind of hidden cost with regard to gender inequality, and that's rooted in the sort of labor distortions that unfortunately is a part of our culture. So again, it's just not clear that this is practical or realistic for the population as a whole. It's just a fact that many people work long hours with multiple jobs, multiple shifts, and Pollan's ideal of cooking from scratch, this kind of model may not fit the daily realities of most people in contemporary life. Indeed, when we look at Pollan's claim that Americans are by and large unhealthy when we compare to other cultures, other nations, other countries like in France or the Mediterranean, right? When we think about those diets and compare it to the American diet, maybe one of the reasons why Americans are obese or unhealthy is maybe it has much more to do with these other factors, with the fact that we're working long hours, multiple jobs, with not a lot of time in our day to be able to do things like prepare food or to, buy ethically sourced products, or maybe so many people live in food deserts that maybe his account is not properly taking into consideration these other factors that actually do a lot to contribute to why Americans are unhealthy in the first place. So maybe it's not merely the fact that historically speaking there is this emphasis on nutritionism. Maybe he's right that that does occur, but maybe that's not the only explanation. Maybe it's not even the best explanation for why Americans' diets are so unhealthy. And this introduces another objection that we should consider. The objection that it's a kind of oversimplification of nutrition science itself, right? Pollan critiques nutritionism, but he oftentimes characterizes it, right? And this is a kind of a straw man objection, right? He portrays nutrition science as always reductionist and always kind of misguided, but nutritionally informed public health measures like trans fat bans or sodium guidelines and folic acid fortifications, right? These have actually saved lives. So it's not really clear that nutritionism is always this reductionist bad idea or ideology that's misguided, as Pollan seems to suggest it is, right? Maybe what he's doing is he's offering up a kind of a straw man that's going to be really easy to knock over. Indeed, when we look closely at the way he argues throughout this book, we can start to see several contradictions or inconsistencies that emerge, right? Pollan relies upon scientific research to support some of his own claims about the harms of processed food. And so this suggests that he cannot fully reject nutrition science while simultaneously using nutrition science to reject it, right? That involves a kind of self undermining approach to this issue. And so, again, you might think that there's an oversimplification of nutrition science or nutritionism itself, which ultimately leads to a kind of straw man view that he's just easily going to knock over, even though it's not necessarily a correct or adequate description of what's going on. You might think that he's sort of cherry picking the science that will help him establish the claims that he wants to argue for and defend, while at the same time ignoring some of the other more detailed and nuanced approaches and views within nutrition science itself. So again, it's just not clear that this is going to be a practical approach, one that is going to be generalizable to the whole population. In fact, I think it does start to seem clear that he can't actually use nutrition science in order to reject nutrition science, because that does seem to be self-undermining in an important kind of way. Now, another important objection that we should be concerned with is what I'm going to call the idealization of culture objection, right? Pollan romanticizes traditional food cultures as inherently wise, right? Our traditional approaches to food is what we should return to. We should reject food science and we should embrace what our grandmothers or our grandparents, what they taught us. There's wisdom in the ages, if you will. There's wisdom in this kind of tradition. But you might think that this actually embraces a kind of cultural relativism that might be problematic. Notice that not all cultures have an approach to food that is healthy. Not all cultures have an approach to food that's sustainable or that's morally acceptable. We might have cultures that have extremely high sodium or extremely high saturated fats. We might have cultures that embrace environmentally destructive practices or unsustainable animal consumption, right? We might have cultures that involve rituals involving food scarcity or maybe purity codes or other sorts of harmful taboos, right? And it looks like if Pollan treats culture as the ultimate authority on what food norms we should embrace, then he's going to slide into various problematic aspects of relativism itself, where relativism may be seen as a kind of unjustified approach to what's morally acceptable. Indeed, we can see clear examples of this. For instance, where there may be traditional diets that often include various kinds of foodborne illnesses, which have been largely solved by modern science and industrialization. So Pollan may idealize the past in this kind of very problematic and unrealistic sense or unrealistic way. Indeed, it looks like one of the worries with embracing this kind of traditional approach to culture as the ultimate authority on what to eat and what the proper diet should be. This seems to involve a kind of fallacy where we're appealing illegitimately to tradition. Just because something is based in tradition does not make it right, right? You might think that there's all kinds of traditions that are actually harmful and problematic, right? So the mere fact that it's traditional doesn't mean that it's correct or that it's morally acceptable. And this raises another kind of an objection that we should be concerned with. I'm going to call this the ethical blind spot objection, where Pollan focuses on individual virtues and framing his ideas in terms of a kind of correct way of doing things, and that seems to underplay this broader ethical consideration that involves things like labor ethics. Right, Pollan endorses small farms and organic agriculture, yet he fails to address things like the exploitation of workers on various farms. He never talks about things like migrant laborers and the conditions that they're working in. He doesn't address the things like racial inequalities in agricultural labor. Many of these sort of ethical worries that are really crucial for how we're understanding agriculture and likewise, he never addresses some of the environmental trade-offs that we have to consider, right? Local organic farming is not always the most sustainable. Sometimes large-scale agriculture has a lower ecological footprint than smaller farms do. And Pollan does not grapple with these sorts of complexities. Indeed, Pollan oftentimes focuses almost entirely upon individual responsibilities, right? He frames eating as a matter of personal choice and personal virtue, while at the same time failing to recognize the structural inequalities that are certainly a part of our agricultural system. If we recognize that food choice is much more than just our personal choice or a kind of personal virtue, then we can see that it involves all sorts of other issues like urban zoning, labor exploitation, agricultural monopolies, things like public transportation, things like school lunch programs. So once we begin to recognize all these different injustices that are a part of our society, then when we blame individuals for their diets, this starts to look quite misguided. In fact, you might think that this actually starts to begin to look a lot like victim blaming, right? Pollan may be blaming the victims of a problematic and unjust and unequitable society because he thinks that it all comes down to our personal responsibilities and our personal virtues as eaters. And so it may be the case that he's actually doing quite a bit of victim blaming here, insofar as he risks moralizing food choices in a way that shames people whose diets are structurally constrained. Now, of course, there may be other objections that we should consider too, but I think that this does a good job of introducing the fact that even though I would say that there's a lot of really excellent points that Pollan makes throughout this book, nonetheless, there may be problems too. Problems that focus on, the practicalities of whether or not the normative claims he offers, especially at the end of the book, really can be applied across the board to everyone and across our society, right? Pollan raises important concerns about the industrial food industry, about nutritionism, and the benefits of traditional eating, and I think all that's pretty good. But when we consider these things from a critical perspective, his approach does seem to face numerous challenges from various kinds of socioeconomic questions, feasibility to the idealization of culture, insofar as we should embrace tradition. All these things seem to be problematic in a number of different ways. And I think by looking at closely and considering these objections will help us think more clearly about whether Pollan's guidance is in fact realistic, normatively justified, or just simply romanticized, like as if he wants to go back to a better time, make America's diet better again, if you will. So I appreciate you considering these objections and spending some time thinking about these issues with me.